The blizzard at Ironhold didn't just bite, it killed. In the center of the courtyard, chained to an iron ring and left to die in the freezing dark, lay the wolf. To the guards, he was a savage beast, a rebel king to be forgotten. To 7-year-old Alice, the kitchen stray, he was simply starving. With nothing to her name but her last crust of stale bread, the girl stepped into the storm. She reached out a trembling hand, entirely unaware that the broken man before her was the rightful sovereign of the realm, and that in this single, fragile act of kindness, she had just sparked a war for his throne. The wind howled through the stone courtyard of Ironhold. It was the kind of brutal winter cold that cracked wooden beams and stole the breath right out of your lungs. 7-year-old Alice huddled near the kitchen exhaust vents. She was desperately trying to catch the thin, greasy wisps of warm air escaping from the scullery. She pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her thin shoulders. Her bare fingers were blue, deeply cracked, and bleeding from scrubbing heavy iron pots since before sunrise. They called her a stray in this castle. She was merely an orphan, left to the dubious mercy of the keep's violent head cook. But mercy was a very rare commodity in Ironhold this season. A sudden, harsh shout drew her attention toward the main gates. The heavy oak doors groaned open, letting in a blinding swirl of snow and freezing wind. 4 armed guards marched into the courtyard. They were dragging something incredibly heavy behind them on a thick, rusted iron chain. At first glance through the snowstorm, Alice thought it was a bear. The figure was massive, hunched over, and covered in a filthy, snow-caked canvas cloak. Then the figure stumbled on the cobblestones, and she saw the man beneath the filth. He was dragged violently toward the center of the open courtyard. One of the guards kicked the back of his knees, forcing the massive man to collapse into the freezing mud. "Stay down, Wolf," the captain spat. He secured the heavy iron chain to a massive metal ring embedded deep in the ground. The man did not speak. He did not cry out in pain. He simply raised his head. His dark hair was matted with dried mud and melting ice. Even from her hiding spot in the shadows, Alice could see the fierce, unbroken glare in his dark eyes. It was a predatory look that made the armed guards instinctively take a nervous step back. This was the prisoner they had been whispering about in the kitchens all week, the dangerous rebel leader captured in the Northern Highlands. The soldiers said he was an absolute savage. They bragged that he was brought here to freeze to death publicly, serving as a grim warning to anyone who defied the new lords of the realm. The guards laughed nervously and hurried back inside to the warmth of the barracks. They left the chained man entirely alone in the gathering blizzard. Night fell quickly over the mountains. The temperature plummeted even further, turning the mud into solid ice. Alice sat in her dark corner, clutching a small, hard lump inside her thing pocket. It was a piece of stale rye bread. She had stolen it from the pig trough earlier that morning when the cook wasn't looking. It was supposed to be her only meal for the next 2 days. Her stomach twisted with a sharp, agonizing cramp. She pulled the bread out, staring at the rough crust. She took a tiny bite. It was as hard as tree bark, but it tasted like an absolute feast to a starving child. Outside, the wind began to scream against the stone walls. Alice looked through the iron grate into the courtyard. The chained prisoner was still out there. He was curled into a tight ball on the frozen ground. The heavy snow was rapidly beginning to bury him alive. He was going to die tonight. Everyone in the castle knew it, and nobody cared. Alice looked down at her half-eaten piece of bread. Then she looked back at the dying man in the snow. She knew exactly what it felt like to freeze. She knew the agonizing hollow pain of a stomach digesting itself. She couldn't just sit there in the dark. Alice slipped out from her hiding place behind the barrels. The icy wind immediately bit into her exposed face like 1,000 tiny needles. She waded through the knee-deep snow. Her bare feet went completely numb within seconds. She approached the massive man slowly. She was terrified he might lash out like the wild beast the guards claimed he was. "Mister?" she whispered. Her small voice was instantly swallowed by the howling wind. The man didn't move. Alice knelt beside him in the snow. She reached out a trembling hand and lightly touched his broad, freezing shoulder. He flinched violently. His head snapped up. Alice gasped and fell backward into the snowdrift. Up close, his face was terrifying. It was bruised, severely scarred, and completely hollowed out by prolonged starvation. Heavy iron shackles bit deep into his raw wrists. The freezing metal was literally sticking to his skin. He stared at her. His broad chest heaved with slow, rattling breaths that plumed in the freezing air. He expected her to throw a stone. He fully expected her to spit on him, just as the castle residents had done all afternoon. But Alice didn't run away. She pushed herself back up onto her knees. Her hand shook uncontrollably from the biting cold. She reached deep into her pocket. She pulled out the piece of stale, dirty rye bread. She held it out to him on her small, bruised palm. The man looked at the bread, then he looked slowly up at the tiny, shivering girl in front of him. Profound confusion flickered across his dark, fierce eyes. "Eat," Alice whispered, pushing her small hand a little closer to his face. "Please." He didn't move for a long moment. It was as if he had completely forgotten what human kindness looked like. Slowly, a massive, heavily scarred hand reached out from beneath the cloak. His rough fingers accidentally brushed against hers. His skin was as cold as a corpse. He took the bread. He brought it to his cracked lips and took a slow bite. He chewed methodically, never taking his intense gaze off her small face. Alice managed a small, hesitant smile despite her chattering teeth. She didn't know his name. She didn't know that the rusted iron collar around his neck was meant to humiliate a true king. She only knew he was hungry, just like her. The man finally swallowed the dry bread. The absolute harshness in his eyes softened, just for a fraction of a second. He shifted his massive body forward, deliberately blocking the worst of the biting wind from hitting the small girl. It was a silent gesture, a quiet, unbreakable promise made in the freezing dark. Alice rubbed her freezing arms. She knew she had to get back before the morning patrol found her missing. "I have to go," she whispered, backing away slowly. She stood up and turned back toward the shadows of the kitchen walls. The man watched her disappear into the dark. The faint taste of the rough bread lingered in his dry mouth. Rowan, the rightful sovereign of the realm, closed his eyes against the snow. He was chained, broken, and left out here to rot by his enemies, but a spark had just been lit in the absolute darkness, a tiny, fragile, human spark. He tightened his massive fists against the iron chains until his knuckles turned white. He was not going to die tonight. He finally had a reason to live. The morning bell rang out across the frozen ramparts of Ironhold. Alice opened her eyes, shivering violently beneath her pile of damp rags. The straw mattress beneath her was stiff with frost. Her breath hung in the cold air of the scullery like heavy white smoke. Every joint in her small body ached from the previous day's labor. She forced herself to stand, her bare feet flinching as they touched the ice-cold stone floor. A harsh voice boomed from the kitchen doorway, shattering the morning quiet. Gilbert, the head cook, stood there with a heavy Whedon rolling pin in his thick hand. "Get up, you lazy brat," Gilbert roared, slamming the wood against the door frame. "The hearth fires are cold, and the young lords demand their morning porridge." Alice rushed forward, nearly tripping over her oversized, tattered smock. She immediately knelt before the massive stone fireplace, ash flying into her face as she cleared the dead coals. Her fingers scraped against the rough iron grate, reopening the painful cracks from yesterday. She kept her head down, working quickly to light the dry kindling before the cook could strike her. As the flames finally caught, the smell of roasting fat and rich spices filled the kitchen. The new masters of the castle were preparing a great feast to celebrate their recent military victories. But for Alice, there would only be the burnt crusts retrieved from the bottom of the iron pots. Her stomach made a loud, hollow sound, but she dared not look at the food on the long tables. Gilbert shoved a massive, greasy iron kettle into her arms, nearly knocking her to the ground. "Take this to the well. Scrub it until you can see your ugly face in it, and don't let me catch you slacking." The heavy iron handles bit into her palms as she dragged the kettle toward the heavy rear door. She pushed the oak door open with her shoulder, stepping back out into the blinding white courtyard. The blizzard had stopped, leaving behind massive snowdrifts that reached her waist. The air was perfectly still, so cold that it made her throat burn with every inhalation. Her eyes immediately darted toward the center of the courtyard. The massive man was still there, chained tightly to the heavy iron ring. He looked like a statue carved from solid gray ice. A thick layer of snow covered his broad shoulders and his dark, matted hair. For a terrible second, Alice thought he'd finally frozen to death during the night. Her heart squeezed with a sudden, sharp pain that she did not completely understand. Then, She saw the faint, rhythmic movement of his massive chest beneath the filthy canvas cloak. He was still alive, fighting the cold with nothing but sheer willpower. 2 castle guards walked past him, laughing loudly as they kicked a cloud of freezing snow directly into his face. The prisoner did not move, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the frozen ground. Alice felt a deep, burning heat in her chest that had nothing to do with the kitchen fires. It was anger, a strange and novel emotion for a girl who had always been taught to be completely submissive. She walked over to the stone well, her wooden clogs crunching loudly in the fresh snow. She purposely chose a spot that allowed her to watch the prisoner while she worked. She dipped her brush into the bucket of lukewarm water, scrubbing the greasy residue from the Lord's breakfast kettle. Her hands grew numb almost instantly, losing all sensation in the freezing air. As she rinsed the pot, she noticed a thick layer of rich, fatty broth left at the bottom of the boiling vat. It was meant to be thrown into the pig trough behind the stables. Alice looked around the courtyard, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. The guards had walked toward the front gates to greet a fresh convoy of supply wagons. Gilbert was inside, screaming at the kitchen boys and preoccupied with the preparation of the midday meal. This was her only chance. She reached into her bodice and pulled out a cracked, discarded wooden goal she had hidden days ago. With trembling hands, she scooped the warm, greasy broth into the bowl until it was nearly full. She covered the bowl with a piece of dirty burlap, hiding it carefully under the heavy pile of scrapings inside her waste bucket. She lifted the heavy bucket, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She walked slowly across the open courtyard, trying to look as small and insignificant as possible. To any observer, she was just an orphan, carrying waste to the dumping pits. As she neared the chained man, she slowed her steps. The massive prisoner seemed to sense her presence, his head shifting slightly beneath his snow-covered cloak. He raised his eyes, and the fierce glare from the previous night returned. But when his gaze locked onto her small, shivering frame, the hard edge in his dark eyes vanished. Alice knelt down a few feet away from him, pretending to adjust the straps on her heavy wooden clogs. She checked the guard tower above. The archer on duty was looking away, blowing into his hands for warmth. She reached into the waste bucket and pulled out the hidden wooden bowl. The broth was no longer hot, but it was still warm enough to send up thin trails of pale steam. "Take it," she whispered, sliding the bowl across the smooth ice toward his bound hands. "Hurry, before they see us." Rowan stared at the wooden bowl, then looked at the girl's face. He saw the purple bruises on her arms and the deep dirt etched into her skin from the morning's hard labor. He knew the risks she was taking for him. If the guards caught her feeding a state prisoner, Gilbert would beat her without mercy, or worse, throw her out into the winter wilderness to die. His scarred wrists groaned against the heavy iron shackles as he reached forward. The frozen metal grated loudly against the stone, a sound that made Alice freeze in absolute terror. He pulled the bowl toward himself, his massive fingers completely covering the wooden rim. He raised it to his mouth and drank the greasy liquid in long, desperate swallows. The warmth hit his starved stomach, sending a sudden rush of vital energy through his frozen limbs. He could feel his deadened muscles slowly coming back to life. Alice watched him, a feeling of immense relief rashing over her small body. For the first time all day, she forgot about her own hunger and the biting pain in her bare fingers. As he finished the last drop, Rowan lowered the bowl. He looked at her with an intensity that made her hold her breath. "What is your name, little one?" His voice was incredibly deep, rough like grinding stones and cracked from days of absolute silence. Alice blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected him to speak the common tongue so clearly. "Alice," she whispered back, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Alice," he repeated, testing the sound of it as if it were a precious gem. A beautiful name for a brave soul. He slid the empty wooden bowl back across the ice toward her. "You must go back inside now. The snakes in this keep are vigilant, and I will not have my savior harmed." "Will you be okay?" Alice asked, her eyes filled with genuine concern for a man the rest of the world considered a monster. Rowan let out a low, dry chuckle that sounded like a rustle of dead leaves. He pulled his canvas cloak tighter around his massive shoulders, blocking a sudden gust of wind from hitting her. "I have survived worse than this winter, little Alice," he said, his dark eyes flashing with a sudden, dangerous light. "The men who put these chains on me think they have broken the king. They are very wrong." Alice didn't fully understand what he meant by the king, but she felt an immense sense of safety standing near him. Despite his terrifying size and his fierce scars, he felt like a great stone wall protecting her from the storms. "I will try to bring more tomorrow," she promised quietly, slipping the empty bowl back into her waste bucket. "Only if it is safe," Rowan commanded softly, his voice full of a natural authority that belonged to a man born to rule. "Live to see the spring, little one. The snow will melt, and everything will change." Alice nodded quickly, stood up, and hurried back toward the kitchen doors with her heavy bucket. She felt a new warmth inside her coat, a tiny ember of hope that the miserable winter would not last forever. Rowan watched her small figure disappear into the dark entryway of the scullery. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the freezing stone wall of the keep. The warmth of the simple broth circulated through his veins, but it was her unprompted kindness that truly saved him. His enemies had stripped him of his crown, his army, and his freedom, but they had failed to strip him of his humanity. He shifted his feet, testing the weight of the massive iron chain attached to the center ring. He felt the cold iron give just a fraction of a millimeter against the stone foundation. He began to count the guards' patrol steps, memorizing the exact timing of their rotations in the shifting snow. The wolf was no longer just surviving. He was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The bitter grip of winter tightened its hold on Ironhold. Days bled into desolate weeks. The thick snow in the courtyard turned into hard, treacherous sheets of black ice. Alice continued her silent routine of survival. Every morning and every evening, she managed to smuggle small scraps of sustenance to the chained man. Sometimes it was just a few hollow bones from the Lord's table. Other times it was a handful of raw oats stolen from the stables. Rowan accepted every meager offering with a quiet, profound grace. He never complained about the taste or the portion. The meager food was slowly working a miracle on his battered frame. The hollows of his cheeks were filling out, and the ash-gray pallor of death was leaving his skin. His muscles, once completely numb and withered, were beginning to regain their dense, natural mass. He was silently rebuilding his strength right in front of his captor's oblivious eyes. But as the sovereign grew stronger, the little girl grew weaker. The relentless draft in the scullery and the freezing water from the well finally took their toll. A deep, rattling cough took root in Alice's small chest. Her thin face grew flushed with a constant, unhealthy fever. She moved through her daily chores like a fragile ghost, swaying under the weight of the iron pots. Rowan watched her deteriorate from his place in the snow. A dark, malevolent fury began to gather in his chest every time he heard her painful coughing echo across the courtyard. He was a man who had commanded vast armies and ruled prosperous lands, yet he was currently powerless to offer a simple blanket to the child who was keeping him alive. The absolute injustice of it gnawed at his soul far worse than the iron shackles biting into his wrists. The breaking point arrived on the eve of the winter solstice. The usurping lords decided to host a massive banquet in the Great Hall. The entire castle was thrown into a state of chaotic, frantic preparation. The kitchen was a blazing furnace of activity. Gilbert the cook was shouting orders, swinging his wooden spoon at anyone who moved too slowly. "More wood for the roasting spits," Gilbert bellowed, his face red from the heat of the hearth. "Yare, Stray, fetch more oak from the far shed and be quick about it." Alice didn't argue. She grabbed a heavy woven basket and stumbled toward the rear door. Her vision was blurry from the raging fever. Every step felt like she was wading through deep, muddy water. She pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped out into the freezing night. The contrast between the stifling kitchen and the bitter winter air made her gasp violently. She dragged her feet across the icy cobblestones, making her way toward the distant woodshed. The wind was particularly violent tonight, howling over the high stern walls like a pack of starved wolves. She reached the shed and loaded the heavy oak logs into her basket. Her hands shook so badly that she dropped the wood twice, crying silently in pure frustration. Finally, she hoisted the heavy basket against her hip and turned back toward the keep. Just as she reached the halfway point across the courtyard, a massive gust of wind swept down from the mountains. The heavy oak door of the kitchen slammed shut with a deafening crack. Alice dropped the basket and ran toward the door. She threw her small weight against the thick wood, but the heavy iron latch had fallen completely into place on the inside. She pounded her bruised fists against the solid oak. "Please," she cried out, her voice raspy and weak, "let me in!" But the loud music and drunken laughter from the great hall completely drowned out her tiny, desperate pleas. Nobody was coming to open the door. She was trapped outside in the dark. The temperature was dropping rapidly. Alice sank to her knees on the ice, her thin smock offering zero protection against the lethal wind. Her cough flared up, racking her tiny frame with violent spasms. She curled into a tight ball against the unyielding stone wall, feeling the terrible cold seeping directly into her bones. She closed her eyes, feeling a strange, heavy numbness washing over her mind. It would be so easy to just fall asleep right here. "Alice!" The deep, resonant voice cut through the howling wind. It was steady, commanding, and infinitely warm. Alice forced her heavy eyes open. Through the swirling snow, she saw the massive silhouette of the chained man. He was straining against his heavy chains, leaning as far toward her as the iron would allow. "Come here, little one," Rowan commanded softly. "Do not go to sleep. Come to me." Alice didn't have the strength to stand. She crawled across the frozen ground on her hands and knees, dragging herself over the jagged ice. Every inch felt like a mile. Her bare fingers left faint, bloody smears on the frozen cobblestones. When she finally reached the center ring, Rowan moved with startling speed. He reached out and pulled her small, freezing body directly into his lap. He threw his heavy, snow-caked canvas cloak completely over her, sealing her inside a pocket of absolute darkness. Inside the cloak, Alice hit a wall of solid, radiating heat. Rowan pressed her small back against his broad, muscular chest. He wrapped his massive, scarred arms securely around her trembling shoulders. "I have you," he whispered, his deep voice vibrating against her back. "You are safe." Alice buried her face into his coarse tunic. She was shaking uncontrollably, her teeth chattering so hard they ached. Rowan shifted his body, positioning his broad back directly against the biting wind. He became a living, breathing fortress, shielding her from the absolute abyss of the winter storm. For a long time, the only sound was the howling wind and the shallow, ragged sound of Alice breathing. Gradually, the intense body heat of the hardened warrior began to thaw the ice in her veins. The violent shivering slowly subsided into small, occasional tremors. "It hurts," Alice mumbled, her voice muffled against his chest. "I know," Rowan replied, his chin resting gently on the top of her head. "The cold is a cruel master, but it will not claim you tonight." Suddenly, the heavy wooden doors of the main keep burst open. Rowan instantly stiffened. He clamped a massive hand gently over Alice's mouth, a silent command for absolute stillness. Heavy, uneven footsteps crunched loudly across the frozen snow. A foul stench of stale ale and sour wine drifted through the crisp air. It was one of the senior garrison captains. He was heavily intoxicated, stumbling toward the center courtyard with a half-empty flagon in his hand. "Look at the great wolf," the captain slurred, kicking a chunk of ice toward Rowan. "Still shivering in the dirt like a beaten cur." Rowan did not flinch. He kept his head bowed, holding his massive arms tightly over his stomach, completely concealing the small girl hidden beneath the canvas folds. The captain walked closer, stopping just inches away from Rowan's boots. He unclasped his heavy fur mantle and mocked the silent prisoner. "The lords are drinking your private cellar dry tonight," the captain sneered, leaning in close. "Your kingdom is gone, your army is dead, and you will die right here on this frozen mud." Underneath the cloak, Alice held her breath in pure terror. She could hear the malicious intent in the soldier's voice. She felt Rowan's heart beating against her back. It was not racing with fear. It was a slow, heavy, rhythmic thud. It was the absolute calm of a predator calculating the distance to its prey. The captain spat on the ground near Rowan's feet, laughed cruelly, and finally turned around to stumble back toward the warmth of the great hall. The heavy doors slammed shut, plunging the courtyard back into the solitary howling of the storm. Rowan let out a long, measured exhale. He slowly removed his hand from Alice's mouth. "He's gone," Rowan whispered. Alice relaxed her tense muscles. "Are you really a king?" she asked softly in the dark. Rowan looked out at the falling snow. For weeks he had been treated as less than dirt. He had been stripped of his name and his dignity. "I was," Rowan answered, his voice devoid of any arrogance, holding only the heavy weight of truth. "And I will be again." He looked down at the lump beneath his cloak. "When the snow melts, Alice, I will take you far away from this wretched place. I will show you a land where the rivers run warm and the bread is always fresh." Alice closed her eyes, letting the comforting sound of his deep voice lull her exhausted mind. "That sounds nice," she murmured, finally drifting into a deep, feverish sleep. Rowan held the sleeping child carefully. He felt a profound sense of clarity wash over his mind. He was no longer just fighting for his stolen throne or his lost pride. He was fighting for the absolute right to protect the innocent from this malevolent world. He shifted his weight slightly. He wrapped his thick fingers around the primary iron link connecting his shackles to the ground ring. He braced his boots against the frozen stone foundation. He took a deep, silent breath, channeling every ounce of his returning strength into his hands. He twisted the rusted metal with steady, terrifying force. Under the cover of the screaming wind, there was a sharp, distinct crack. The iron links fractured. It was a small break, barely visible to the naked eye, but it was enough. The long wait was over. The time for silent endurance had passed. Retribution was finally coming to Ironhold. Dawn arrived at Ironhold not with the warmth of sunlight, but with a pale, suffocating gray mist. The great blizzard had finally exhausted its mindless fury against the stone walls. Inside the courtyard, a heavy, deathly silence hung in the freezing air. The usurpers and their elite guards were still dully unconscious in the great hall, heavily intoxicated by their arrogant celebrations. Beneath the snow-covered canvas cloak, Alice remained perfectly still. Her dangerous fever had miraculously broken during the long, dark hours of the night. She was breathing softly, anchored to the harsh world solely by the immense, radiating heat of the massive man holding her. Rowan's eyes were wide open, staring into the fading shadows of the dawn. They had been open for hours. His massive hands rested loosely on his knees in the snow. The heavy iron chain that had anchored his soul to the stone foundation now lay fractured and useless beneath the ice. He did not immediately rise to his feet. He waited in the dark with the infinite, cold patience of an apex predator observing its domain. The heavy oak doors of the scullery suddenly swung open with a violent crash, shattering the fragile morning quiet. Gilbert, the head cook, stomped aggressively out onto the icy cobblestones. His meaty face was twisted in a mask of ugly, venomous rage. "Stray!" Gilbert bellowed, his harsh voice echoing sharply against the high, frost-covered stone walls. "Where are you hiding, you worthless rat?" Two junior guards, tasked with the early morning watch, trailed miserably behind him. They were shivering in their thin chainmail, nursing severe hangovers from the night's excessive drinking. Gilbert gripped a thick, solid oak walking stick tightly in his heavy hand. He scanned the empty, snow-blinded courtyard, his small eyes narrowing as they landed on the massive mound in the center. "So, hiding with the dead wolf, are we?" Gilbert sneered loudly, marching directly toward the iron center ring. "I will beat the skin off your back for leaving the hearth fires cold." Under the thick canvas cloak, Alice stirred slightly at the hateful sound of the cook's approaching footsteps. A tiny whimper of deeply ingrained terror escaped dry, cracked lips. Rowan felt her small, fragile body tense instantly against his broad chest. A terrifying, absolute stillness settled over his entire massive frame. Gilbert reached the center of the frozen courtyard. He raised his heavy oak stick high into the freezing morning air with a cruel grin. With a vicious grunt of effort, the cook reached down and violently yanked the snow-caked cloak completely away. He fully expected to find a cowering child crying beside a frozen, defeated corpse. Instead, he found himself stared directly into the abyssal, wrathful eyes of a fully awakened sovereign. Rowan moved with a terrifying speed that defied his massive size. Before Gilbert could even begin to swing the heavy stick downward, A massive, heavily scarred hand shot upward like a striking serpent. Rowan caught the thick oak weapon effortlessly in midair. Gilbert gasped sharply, suddenly completely unable to move the wooden stick a single inch downward. With a simple, fluid twist of his thick wrist, Rowan shattered the solid oak stick into a dozen jagged splinters. The head cook stumbled backward in absolute shock, his small eyes wide with sudden, primal horror. The state prisoner was supposed to be starved, frozen, and completely broken in spirit, but the man rising slowly from the icy ground was a towering monument of lethal, barely contained physical violence. Rowan stood to his full, formidable height for the first time in weeks. He completely eclipsed the pale morning light, casting a massive, suffocating shadow over the three terrified men. He carefully gathered Alice into his strong left arm. He held her small, shivering form securely against his chest, completely shielding her from the impending brutality. The broken length of heavy iron chain dangled loosely from his right wrist. It was no longer a humiliating symbol of captivity, it had transformed into a devastating instrument of absolute retribution. "Guards!" Gilbert shrieked in absolute panic, scrambling clumsily backward on the slippery, treacherous ice. "Kill him! The beast is loose!" The two hungover soldiers fumbled frantically at their belts for their broadswords. They charged forward, their movements sluggish and pitifully uncoordinated in the deep snow. Rowan did not even bother to draw a proper weapon. He simply didn't need one. He swung his thick right arm in a sudden, devastating horizontal arc. The heavy iron links caught the morning mist, humming with a terrifying kinetic energy. The broken chain struck the first charging guard squarely in the center of his chest. There was a sickening sound like thunder, echoing through a narrow stone canyon. The iron plates of the guard's armor caved inward instantly under the sheer, unadulterated force. The impact lifted the grown man entirely off his feet, sending him flying backward through the air. He crashed heavily into the frozen stone well and did not move again. The second guard froze instantly in sheer, paralyzing terror. His drawn sword trembled violently in his grip as he stared at his fallen comrade in the snow. Rowan stepped forward with deliberate, predatory grace. His movements were completely devoid of frantic haste. They were methodical, graceful, and utterly lethal. He reached out and grabbed the remaining guard easily by the thick leather collar of his armor. With a single, effortless heave of his massive shoulders, Rowan threw the soldier across the courtyard like a discarded rag doll. The man slammed violently into the solid oak doors of the armory and slumped deeply into the snowdrifts, completely incapacitated by the concussive force. Absolute silence rapidly reclaimed the frosty courtyard. The quiet was broken only by the ragged, terrified breathing of the head cook. Gilbert was completely trapped, his back pressed hard against the cold courtyard wall. His cowardly legs simply refused to support his weight, and he slid down onto the ice in a pathetic, trembling heap. Rowan walked slowly toward him. The heavy leather boots of the king crunched loudly against the frozen earth, sounding exactly like the steady beat of an executioner's drum. Alice peeked cautiously out from the warm folds of the heavy tunic. Her wide, innocent eyes took in the swift scene of complete physical devastation. She felt absolutely no fear of the towering, dangerous man holding her. The muscular arms cradling her were infinitely gentle, providing an absolute sanctuary from the harsh world. Rowan stopped, towering majestically over the groveling, weeping cook. The sheer difference in their physical presence and aura was staggering to witness. "You starved her," Rowan stated flatly. His voice was no longer a raspy whisper. It was a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the courtyard. "Mercy, my lord," Gilbert sobbed loudly, pressing his sweaty face directly into the freezing mud. "I was only following the new lord's orders. I am but a humble, worthless servant." "A servant who eagerly beats starving children," Rowan replied coldly. There was no hot rage in his tone, only the absolute chilling finality of supreme justice. Rowan raised his heavy right foot and placed his thick leather boot squarely on the cook's broad shoulder. With a sudden, calculated surge of downward pressure, he pinned the massive man completely and inescapably to the ice of ground. The dull, heavy sound of a snapping collarbone echoed sharply in the quiet morning air. Gilbert let out a muffled, agonizing scream, completely immobilized by the overwhelming physical dominance. "You will remain pinned in this snow," Rowan commanded, looking down with an expression of profound, aristocratic disgust. "You will feel the exact freezing agony she felt every night." Rowan turned his broad back on the broken man without a single backward glance. He adjusted his gentle grip on Alice, ensuring she was completely wrapped in the residual warmth of his heavy cloak. He looked down into her pale, wide-eyed face. "Are you frightened of me, little one?" he asked, his deep, commanding voice softening instantly to a warm whisper. Alice shook her head slowly. She rested her cheek safely against his broad chest, listening to the steady, powerful, and reassuring rhythm of his heart. "No. You are just very strong." A faint, genuinely warm smile touched the corners of Rowan's severely scarred mouth. It was a rare, beautiful expression that transformed his fierce countenance into something entirely protective and noble. "It is time for us to leave this frozen graveyard," Rowan said quietly into the wind. He walked purposefully toward the heavy rear gates of the castle. The massive iron portcullis was lowered and locked shut, firmly barring their exit to the mountains. Rowan did not search for a key. He did not pause to call for a gatekeeper to grant him passage. He simply reached out with his massive free hand and gripped the solid, freezing iron bars of the gate. His dense muscles strained visibly, bulging against the coarse fabric of his ruined tunic. With a raw, guttural display of terrifying, inhuman strength, he began to lift the incredibly heavy iron gate directly off the frozen ground. The rusted metal screamed loudly in absolute protest, a sound that loudly echoed the final, inevitable collapse of Ironhold's stolen authority. The rusted iron portcullis screamed a sharp, metallic protest against the silent morning air. Rowan's massive shoulders corded with immense, undeniable power as he hoisted the ton of solid steel. He raised it just high enough to slip his broad frame underneath, never once loosening his protective hold on Alice. Once clear of the stone threshold, he released his formidable grip. The massive gate crashed violently back into the frozen mud, burying itself so deeply that the locking mechanism shattered entirely. Ironhold was permanently sealed behind them. The sovereign had officially departed his cage, and the vast, unforgiving wilderness awaited. Before them then the desolate, sweeping expanse of the northern highlands. The brutal winter storm had buried the ancient pine forests under a monolithic blanket of suffocating white. The air here was thin, sharp, and entirely hostile to any fragile life. Yet Rowan walked into the freezing wasteland with the steady, measured stride of a conqueror returning to his rightful domain. Every heavy step he took crushed the deep snowpack into solid ice beneath his thick leather boots. He was a walking furnace of raw vitality, completely indifferent to the lethal temperatures. In his strong left arm, Alice remained securely bundled within the thick canvas folds of his prisoner's cloak. She felt absolutely no biting wind. She felt no creeping frost. To her, the treacherous mountain path was merely a gentle, rocking motion, accompanied by the steady, powerful drumming of his colossal heart. She was a tiny, fragile sparrow, nesting safely against the chest of an immovable stone mountain. Back within the high walls of Ironhold, the morning bell finally began to toll in frantic, chaotic rhythms. Lord Vance, the cruel usurper who had wrongfully claimed the fortress, stumbled out into the courtyard wrapped in expensive furs. His head pounded with the foul aftermath of cheap wine, but the horrific scene before him instantly sobered his malevolent mind. His elite mourning guard lay scattered across the icy cobblestones like broken, discarded toys. Gilbert the cook was whimpering pathetically in the mud, completely immobilized by a shattered shoulder and severe frostbite. But it was the center of the courtyard that made Lord Vance's blood run absolutely cold. The heavy iron chain was snapped cleanly in half. The thick, forged steel link had not been cut with a file or broken with a heavy blacksmith's hammer. It had been fractured by pure, unadulterated brute force. Panic, cold and sharp as an assassin's dagger, pierced the usurper's arrogant heart. "The wolf is loose!" Vance screamed, his aristocratic voice cracking with sudden, overwhelming terror. "Sound the alarms! Wake the entire garrison!" Chaos erupted instantly within the keep as armed men scrambled frantically, slipping on the treacherous ice in their haste. "He has no food and no weapons!" Vance yelled, desperately trying to mask his rising dread with false bravado. "He is dragging a worthless kitchen stray. He cannot possibly survive the mountains." But Vance looked down at the shattered iron chain again, and he knew he was lying to himself. "Saddle the heavy cavalry. Release the tracking hounds," the usurper commanded, his face pale with dread. "Do not engage him in close combat under any circumstances. Shoot him down from a distance." The heavy war horns of Ironhold echoed mournfully across the frozen valley, signaling the beginning of a desperate, doomed hunt. Miles away, high on the tree-lined ridge, Rowan heard the distant, cowardly call of the castle horns. He did not break his steady pace. He did not even bother to look back over his shoulder. He merely adjusted his gentle grip on Alas, shifting her slight weight effortlessly to ensure she remained perfectly balanced against his broad chest. "Are they coming for us?" Alas asked. Her small voice was muffled by the heavy wool tunic, but it carried a faint trace of lingering childhood anxiety. Rowan looked down at the tiny bundle resting securely in his arms. He reached up with his massive right hand, carefully bringing it close to her face. His thick, severely scarred fingers gently brushed a stray lock of dark hair away from her pale forehead. The sheer size difference between his rough, battle-hardened hand and her tiny, fragile face was visually breathtaking. Yet, his touch was infinitely controlled, lighter than a falling snowflake. "They are coming, little one," Rowan answered, his deep voice resonating with absolute, unshakable calm. "But they are foolish men chasing phantoms in the snow." He turned his intense gaze toward the towering, jagged peaks of the Dragontooth Pass rising majestically ahead of them. "Their armored horses will break their legs in these deep drifts," he stated smoothly, his brilliant tactical mind calculating every variable of the harsh terrain. "And their hounds will lose our scent in the high crosswinds." Alas peeked out from the warm cloak, looking up at the intimidating vertical cliffs towering above the tree line. "It looks very steep," she whispered, her small fingers clutching tightly at the coarse fabric of his tunic. "It is treacherous," Rowan agreed quietly, "but I have marched victorious armies through these passes long before you were even born. This mountain recognizes its true master." He stepped forward, leaving the main road entirely and plunging directly into the untamed, hazardous wilderness. The snow here was deep enough to swallow a normal man completely up to his chest. For Rowan, it was merely a minor physical inconvenience to be battered aside by his immense strength. He used his broad, muscular shoulders to physically plow through the dense, snow-laden thickets, clearing a safe, walkable path for the precious cargo he carried. Hours passed in a grueling, relentless march upward. The temperature began to plummet once more as the pale winter sun struggled vainly to pierce the gray canopy of the ancient forest. A normal survivor would have collapsed hours ago from sheer exhaustion and lethal exposure. Rowan did not even breathe heavily. The meager scraps of bread and warm broth Alas had sacrificed for him had ignited an unquenchable furnace of endurance within his massive frame. He was driven not merely by the primal desire to escape, but by a profound, sovereign duty. He had to protect the one innocent soul who had shown him absolute mercy in the depths of his abyss. Eventually, as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Rowan found exactly what he was looking for. Beneath the massive, sprawling roots of an ancient oak tree, there was a deep, dry hollow sheltered entirely from the biting wind. He carefully ducked beneath the heavy timber roots and knelt on the dry, hard-packed earth of the cavern. Only then did he gently lower Alas to the ground. He unwrapped the heavy canvas cloak with extreme care, letting her breathe the crisp, still air of their temporary sanctuary. Alas sat on the dry earth, looking up at him in quiet, unfiltered awe. He was towering, majestic, and completely unfazed by the brutal physical toll of their relentless mountain march. Rowan knelt beside her on the cavern floor. He reached out and gently took her small, bruised hands into his own massive, scarred palms. Her skin was still pale, but the deadly, freezing chill had been entirely banished by his constant body heat. "You are warm," Rowan observed quietly, his dark, calculating eyes scanning her carefully for any sign of returning illness. "Because of you," Alas replied simply, offering him a small, genuine smile that reached her bright eyes. Rowan looked at her tiny smile. It was a fragile, beautiful thing in a malevolent world that had shown them both nothing but profound cruelty. He closed his massive hands gently over hers, entirely enveloping her fingers in warmth and absolute security. "We rest here to the hour," Rowan commanded softly, settling his massive frame directly against the cave entrance to block the wind. "Sleep, little Alas, the king stands watch." The temporary sanctuary beneath the ancient oak roots remained draped in profound, heavy silence. Alas was fast asleep, her breathing finely deep and completely even. The terrifying fever that had threatened to consume her fragile life had vanished entirely, driven away by the overwhelming warmth of her colossal protector. Rowan sat perfectly still at the entrance of the earthen hollow. He was a silent, immovable monolith, carved from dark stone, his intense eyes piercing the descending twilight of the northern mountains. The wind had died down, leaving the frozen wasteland suspended in a state of crystalline, fragile stillness. It was in this absolute quiet that Rowan's hyper-tuned senses detected the inevitable approach of malevolence. It started as a faint, rhythmic vibration deep within the frozen bedrock. Then came the sharp, unmistakable crunch of armored hooves breaking through the thick crust of the mountain ice. The usurper's heavy tracking unit had finally arrived. Rowan did not show a single trace of panic. He did not rush or scramble in the face of the approaching threat. He slowly turned his broad shoulders, looking back into the dim cavern where Alas slept peacefully. He reached out and gently pulled the heavy canvas cloak tighter around her small, vulnerable form. "Sleep, little one," Rowan whispered, his deep voice carrying the undeniable weight of a binding celestial oath. "The storm outside will not touch you." He stood up, his massive head brushing the low, thick timber roof of the hollow. With effortless, terrifying strength, Rowan hoisted a massive granite boulder that lay near the entrance. He placed the immense stone carefully over the opening of the hollow, leaving only a tiny, hidden fissure for fresh air. Alas was now completely sealed within a fortified vault of earth and stone, entirely shielded from the violent reality of the world above. Rowan stepped fully out into the fade winter light, walking deliberately away from the ancient oak to draw the danger away from his hidden treasure. He stood in the center of a wide, snow-covered clearing, crossing his thick, scarred arms over his broad chest. He waited with the primordial, infinite patience of an apex predator welcoming its prey into the abyss. From the tree line beneath the ridge, a pack of massive, heavily muscled tracking hounds emerged first. They were vicious beasts, bred specifically for hunting men, their jaws slavering and their eyes wild with predatory hunger. The hounds charged aggressively toward the lone, towering figure standing in the snow, but as they closed the distance, the lead hound suddenly skidded to a violent halt, kicking up a massive cloud of icy powder. The beast took one look into Rowan's dark, abyssal eyes, and its primal instincts completely overrode its brutal training. The hound did not see a fleeing, exhausted prisoner. It saw an undeniable sovereign force of nature that radiated absolute, lethal dominance. The vicious pack instantly tucked their tails between their legs, whimpering in sheer, unadulterated terror. They scrambled backward frantically, utterly refusing to step 1 inch closer to the silent king. Moments later, the heavy cavalry broke through the tree line, their dark iron armor completely absorbing the pale evening light. There were a dozen elite men, fully clad in impenetrable plate mail, wielding heavy broadswords and wickedly sharp lances. The captain of the guard sneered behind his steel visor, reining in his massive warhorse. "So, the mighty wolf has finally run out of places to hide," the captain mocked loudly, his voice muffled by his heavy helm. "Where is the little kitchen stray? Did you leave her to freeze so you could run faster?" Rowan's expression remained a mask of cold, unbreakable granite, but deep within his dark eyes, a terrifying, cataclysmic storm of pure, sovereign wrath ignited instantly. To mention the child was to seal their absolute doom. "Dismount and take him!" the captain commanded arrogantly, completely misjudging the sheer magnitude of the threat before him. "The Lord Vance wants him brought back alive for the executioner's block." 6 heavily armored knights slid clumsily from their saddles, their heavy boots sinking deeply into the treacherous snowpack. They drew their broadswords, advancing on Rowan in a tight, disciplined semicircle. They expected the starved prisoner to cower, to surrender, or to blindly rush them in an act of futile desperation. Rowan did none of those things. He simply stepped forward. His movement was incredibly fluid, devoid of all human hesitation, radiating the inescapable gravity of an incoming avalanche. The first knight swung his heavy broadsword in a vicious, horizontal arc aimed directly at Rowan's unprotected neck. Rowan did not dodge. He did not retreat. He simply raised his left forearm, intercepting the descending steel blade with the thick, rusted iron shackles still firmly attached to his wrist. The impact sounded like a cathedral bell shattering into 1,000 pieces. The knight's heavy broadsword violently ricocheted off the unbreakable iron, the intense kinetic shockwave instantly dislocating the man's shoulder. Before the knight could even register the agonizing pain, Rowan's massive right hand shot forward like a striking leviathan. He gripped the knight squarely by the heavy steel breastplate. With a raw, terrifying display of supreme physical power, Rowan lifted the fully armored man entirely off the ground with one hand. He hurled the knight backward with devastating kinetic force. The armored body flew through the freezing air and slammed catastrophically into the trunk of a massive pine tree. The solid iron armor crumpled inward with a sickening crunch, rendering the knight instantly and permanently unconscious. The remaining 5 men froze, their arrogant confidence shattering entirely into pure, paralyzing dread. This was not a broken prisoner. This was a god of war walking amongst mortals. "Kill him!" the captain shrieked from horseback, his voice cracking with sudden, overwhelming panic. "Use your lances! Run him down!" 2 mounted knights spurred their heavy war horses forward, lowering their lethal wooden lances direct into Rowan's broad chest. Rowan stood his ground, planting his heavy boots deeply into the frozen earth. He waited until the razor-sharp steel tips were mere inches from his heart. Then he moved with a speed that entirely defied his massive, muscular bulk. He sidestepped the charging beasts with absolute precision. As the first horse thundered past, Rowan struck outward with a devastating open-palmed blow aimed directly at the thick wooden shaft of the lance. The heavy ash wood instantly splintered into useless dust beneath the cataclysmic impact of his massive hand. Without pausing for a single fraction of a second, Rowan reached up and grabbed the passing knight firmly by his heavy steel belt. He used the horse's own immense momentum against the rider, ripping the screaming man violently from his saddle. Rowan slammed the knight mercilessly into the frozen ground. The seismic impact sent a shockwave through the ice, instantly shattering the man's armor plates and plunging him into a deep, absolute darkness. The battlefield devolved instantly from a disciplined capture mission into a one-sided, terrifying massacre of absolute physical dominance. Rowan moved through the chaotic snow like a phantom of sovereign retribution. He did not spill blood. He did not sever limbs. He merely applied overwhelming, blunt kinetic force that crushed steel helms, shattered heavy iron shields, and completely neutralized every single threat with surgical, brutal efficiency. Within minutes, the vast, snowy clearing was littered with groaning, unconscious men trapped inside their ruined, useless armor. Only the captain remained, sitting atop his trembling warhorse, entirely paralyzed by the sheer horror of the impossible destruction. Rowan turned slowly toward the final rider. His chest heaved slightly, but his dark, abyssal eyes were entirely calm, utterly devoid of mercy or hesitation. The captain whimpered, dropping his heavy sword into the snow. He aggressively kicked his spurs into his horse's flanks, desperately attempting to flee back down the mountain pass. Rowan did not pursue him. He simply reached down into the snow and picked up a heavy, broken iron broadsword discarded by one of the fallen knights. He weighed the ruined weapon in his massive hand for a brief second. Then, with a terrifying surge of muscular power, he hurled the heavy iron blade through the air like a lethal javelin. The blade whistled sharply through the freezing wind. It struck a thick, overarching branch on a dead pine tree situated directly above the fleeing captain. The massive, frozen timber snapped cleanly in half under the immense kinetic impact. The heavy log plummeted downward, crashing squarely onto the captain's helmet and knocking him violently from his panicked horse. The usurper's elite hunting party was completely and entirely annihilated. Silence rapidly reclaimed the frozen mountain ridge. Rowan stood alone amidst the devastation, his broad shoulders relaxed, his sovereign duty perfectly fulfilled. He took a deep breath of the crisp, freezing air, letting the dark, malevolent energy of the battle slowly drain from his veins. He turned his back on the broken soldiers, completely indifferent to their ultimate fate in the freezing wilderness. He walked slowly back toward the massive granite boulder hiding the earthen hollow. He carefully rolled the immense stone away, ensuring not a single grain of dirt fell onto the sleeping child within. Rowan stepped back into the dark cavern. He knelt quietly beside Alyss, his massive frame instantly transforming from an engine of cataclysmic destruction back into a gentle, unyielding sanctuary. Alyss stirred slightly, opening her bright, innocent eyes to look up at him. "Did you hear the wind, little one?" Rowan asked softly, his deep voice carrying only warmth and absolute peace. "It was very loud," Alyss whispered, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "But I wasn't scared." Rowan reached out, gently pulling the heavy canvas cloak securely around her tiny shoulders. "There is nothing left in this world to frighten you," the sovereign promised quietly, his dark eyes shining with absolute, unwavering resolve. "The storm has passed." The morning sun finally broke through the monolithic gray clouds that had choked the northern mountains for weeks. Brilliant, luminescent rays of pale golden light cascaded across the endless expanse of the white wasteland. Rowan emerged from the dark earthen hollow, carrying Alyss safely in the crook of his massive left arm. He deliberately altered their course, choosing a steep, treacherous ascent that completely bypassed the ruined hunting party below. He refused to let the innocent eyes of his tiny savior witness the brutal aftermath of his sovereign retribution. The path he chose was an ancient, forgotten trail known only to the true rulers of the realm. It was carved directly into the sheer face of the Dragontooth Mountain, a vertical ascension that would have paralyzed a normal man with vertigo. But Rowan climbed the icy precipice with the effortless grace of a mountain leopard. His heavy leather boots found perfect purchase on the microscopic ridges of the frozen stone. His thick, heavily scarred right hand anchored them to the cliffside, possessing an unbreakable grip that defied gravity itself. Alyss clung to his broad neck, completely hidden within the folds of the heavy canvas cloak. She did not look down into the dizzying, abyssal drop beneath them. She only looked at the strong, squared line of his jaw and the fierce, unyielding concentration in his dark eyes. She felt absolutely invincible in his arms. By midday, they reached a wide, secluded plateau suspended high above the clouds. The air here was completely still, pristine, and tasting of crushed pine needles and ancient ice. Rowan walked toward a massive, towering slab of black slate jutting out from the mountainside. Buried beneath a thick layer of undisturbed snow was a subtle, complex geometric sigil carved deep into the stone. It was the royal crest of the abyssal sovereign, invisible to anyone who did not possess the royal bloodline. Rowan pressed his massive paw against the center of the carving, applying a precise, overwhelming surge of kinetic pressure. A heavy, grinding sound echoed across the silent plateau as a hidden stone compartment slid smoothly open. Inside the ancient cache lay a sealed, watertight iron box, perfectly preserved against the ravages of the harsh elements. Rowan carefully set Alyss down on a dry patch of sun-warmed stone. He broke the heavy wax seal on the iron box with a simple, effortless flick of his thick thumb. Inside lay the emergency provisions meant exclusively for the vanguard of the king. He pulled out a heavy parcel wrapped in thick, oiled parchment. When he unfolded the heavy paper, the sweet, rich scent of preserved winter wheat and pure sugar filled the crisp air. It was a loaf of dense, sweet white bread, perfectly preserved, accompanied by a small glass jar of crystallized golden honey. Rowan knelt before the small girl, his massive frame completely eclipsing the bright midday sun. His rough, battle-scarred fingers, capable of crushing steel armor into dust, moved with incredibly delicate, almost reverent precision. He broke off a soft, substantial piece of the sweet bread. He dipped it deeply into the golden honey, ensuring it was generously coated in the rich, life-giving sweetness. He held it out to her, resting it gently on his massive, calloused palm. "I promised you a land where the bread is always fresh," Rowan said quietly, his deep voice resonating with absolute sincerity. Alice stared at the beautiful, golden food with wide, disbelieving eyes. In the filthy kitchens of Ironhold, such delicacies were reserved exclusively for the High Lords and the cruel garrison captains. She reached out with trembling, bruised fingers and took the piece of bread from his massive hand. She took a tiny, hesitant bite, half expecting someone to suddenly shout and strike her for stealing. The profound sweetness exploded on her tongue, melting instantly and sending a rush of pure, warm energy through her fragile body. A bright, brilliant smile instantly illuminated her pale, thin face, chasing away the last lingering shadows of her terrible fever. "It is like eating sunshine," Alice whispered in pure, unfiltered awe. Rowan felt a strange, profound tightness in his broad chest that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. He watched her eat, silently vowing that this tiny, fragile creature would never know the agony of starvation again. He broke off another piece, patiently feeding the girl who had offered him a rock-hard crust when he was dying in the freezing mud. The absolute juxtaposition of his lethal, monstrous power and her exquisite vulnerability created a heartbreaking visual poetry. Once she had eaten her fill, Rowan reached toward a cluster of dormant winterthorn bushes growing near the stone cache. He snapped a few flexible green vines with his massive fingers. With surprising, meticulous dexterity, the sovereign wove the slender vines into a small, delicate circlet. He gently placed the makeshift crown upon Alice's dark, tangled hair. "Every lady of the realm requires a crown," Rowan stated softly, his fierce eyes softening into a warm, protective gaze. Alice reached up, her small fingers lightly touching the woven vines. She did not fully understand the profound weight of his words, but she knew she had never felt so incredibly cherished in her entire life. Rowan secured the remaining supplies, wrapped Alice back into the heavy cloak, and continued their march across the high plateau. As the afternoon sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, they finally reached the edge of the Great Northern Divide. Rowan stepped up to the precipice and looked down into a vast, hidden glacial valley. Carved directly into the heart of the living mountain was a colossal, monolithic stone fortress. It was a staggering feat of ancient architecture, its massive black towers piercing the low-hanging clouds like jagged spears. This was the Obsidian Sanctuary, the impenetrable, secret redoubt of the Loyalist army. Rowan began the steep descent, navigating the narrow, treacherous switchbacks with relentless mechanical efficiency. As they approached the monumental iron gates of the fortress, a deep, booming war horn sounded from the high watchtowers. The massive gates swung open instantly, revealing a heavily fortified courtyard completely packed with heavily armored men. These were not the sloppy, drunken mercenaries of the usurper's garrison. These were the sovereign's vanguard, massive, brutal veterans of 100 bloody campaigns clad in pristine, pitch-black plate armor. They rushed forward, their heavy broadswords drawn, their eyes scanning the tree line for any approaching threat. The captain of the vanguard, a towering giant nearly as massive as Rowan himself, charged toward the lone figure approaching from the snow. "Halt and declare yourself!" the captain bellowed, his voice echoing like rolling thunder across the icy valley. Rowan did not halt. He stepped fully into the light of the massive torches burning by the gatehouse. He threw back his heavy canvas hood, revealing his fierce, severely scarred face and his absolute, unyielding sovereign glare. The vanguard captain froze instantly in his tracks. The heavy broadsword slipped from his thick fingers, clattering loudly against the freezing stone courtyard. Absolute, staggering silence fell over the entire military encampment. The captain fell to his knees in the deep snow, bowing his heavy, helmeted head until it touched the freezing ground. "My king!" the captain choked out, his rough, booming voice trembling with overwhelming, disbelieving emotion. "You have returned from the abyss." Like a massive wave crashing upon the shore, hundreds of heavily armored warriors dropped simultaneously to their knees. The synchronized sound of heavy steel plates hitting the stone echoed through the valley like a seismic tremor. Alice peeked out from beneath the canvas cloak, her wide eyes taking in the breathtaking sight of the massive, fearsome army kneeling in total submission. She looked up at Rowan, finally realizing the true, terrifying magnitude of the man who had carried her through the storm. Rowan stood tall, his broad shoulders squared, projecting an aura of absolute, terrifying dominance over the gathered forces. "Rise, my brothers," Rowan commanded, his deep voice carrying flawlessly to the very back of the massive courtyard. The army rose as one, a terrifying wall of dark steel and unshakable loyalty. Rowan gently shifted Alice in his arms, turning his body so the entire vanguard could clearly see the tiny, fragile girl holding onto his neck. "Behold the savior of the sovereign," Rowan declared, his voice ringing with the undeniable authority of absolute law. He placed his massive, scarred hand gently over Alice's small back, a visual shield that promised immediate, cataclysmic death to anyone who dared threaten her. "When the traitors bound me in iron and left me to the freezing void, it was this child who brought me warmth," Rowan proclaimed fiercely. "She is Alice of Ironhold," the king decreed, his dark eyes sweeping over his elite warriors. "And from this day until the end of my reign, she stands under my absolute protection." The heavy knights raised their massive gauntlets, striking them in unison against their steel breastplates. The rhythmic, thunderous salute shook the very foundations of the mountain, a solemn, unbreakable vow of loyalty to the tiny orphan girl. Alice buried her face warmly against Rowan's broad, muscular chest. She was no longer a worthless stray destined to freeze in a forgotten kitchen. She was the exalted ward of the most dangerous, powerful man in the known world, and she was finally, truly home. Alice opened her eyes to a world composed entirely of radiant warmth and unimaginable softness. For a brief, disorienting moment, her panicked mind thought she had died in the freezing snow and simply drifted into the heavens. She was no longer huddled on a frost-covered straw mat in the dark, drafty scullery of Ironhold. She was buried deep beneath a mountain of heavy, luxurious furs in a bed large enough to sleep a dozen grown men. A massive stone hearth dominated the far wall of the cavernous royal chamber. A roaring fire crackled merrily within the grate, casting a deep, golden glow across the polished obsidian walls. The suffocating, perpetual chill that had lived inside her small bones for years was completely and utterly gone. She sat up slowly, the incredibly soft silk sheets rustling quietly against her clean skin. Someone had gently bathed away the grease and soot of her former life while she slept. She was now dressed in a finely woven linen nightgown that felt like a warm cloud against her bruised, battered frame. An elderly man sitting quietly near the fireplace immediately stood up at the sound of her movement. He wore the dark, tailored robes of the royal physician, his face lined with profound wisdom and quiet respect. He did not bark orders at her, nor did he raise his hand in the sudden violence she had always expected from adults. Instead, he approached the massive bed with a slow, deliberate gentleness, bowing his head deeply before he even spoke. "Good morning, little lady," the physician said softly, his voice as smooth as aged parchment. "How does your chest feel today?" Alice blinked in absolute astonishment. Nobody had ever addressed her with a title, let alone asked about her well-being. "It doesn't hurt," Alice whispered, realizing with profound shock that her agonizing, rattling cough had completely vanished. The physician smiled warmly, carrying a small silver tray to the edge of the mattress. He gently applied a fragrant, warming salve to her deeply cracked hands and the severe chilblains on her bare feet. The medicine immediately neutralized the lingering, stinging pain of the harsh winter environment. "The sovereign commanded that you receive the absolute best care in the realm," the old man explained quietly. "Your swift recovery is his primary concern." Before Alice could fully process the weight of those words, the heavy oak doors of the chamber slowly swung open. Rowan stepped fully into the golden light of the royal quarters. He was no longer the starving, mud-pricked prisoner chained to a frozen courtyard ring. He was dressed in the dark, immaculate tunics of the true ruling monarch, his massive shoulders draped in a heavy cloak of black wolf fur. The severe scars on his rugged face remained, but they now looked like the majestic, undisputed markings of a conquering warlord. He moved across the stone floor with the silent, overwhelming gravity of a shifting mountain. The elderly physician immediately dropped to one knee, bowing his head in total, unquestioning submission to the sovereign. Rowan dismissed the old man with a single, authoritative wave of his massive, scarred hand. He approached the edge of the oversized bed, his immense physical presence completely filling the vast room. Yet, as his dark, abyssal eyes locked onto the tiny girl sitting among the heavy furs, the absolute dominance of his aura dissolved into pure warmth. He knelt on the stone floor, bringing his fierce face level with hers, so he would not tower over her fragile form. "You look much better this morning, Alice," Rowan rumbled, his deep, resonant voice carrying an undeniable gentleness. "I am very warm," Alice replied, her bright eyes wide with quiet, unfiltered awe at his majestic transformation. Rowan reached out with his massive right hand. His thick fingers, capable of snapping heavy iron chains, moved with breathtaking, meticulous care. He gently tucked a stray lock of clean dark hair behind her small ear. "You will never be cold again," the sovereign promised, his tone carrying the binding weight of an ancient celestial vow. "That life is permanently erased." A heavy knock echoed from the open doorway. The towering, incredibly muscular captain of the vanguard stepped carefully into the room, holding a large silver tray. This was a veteran warrior who had ruthlessly slaughtered hundreds of men on the battlefield, yet he approached the small girl with the extreme, cautious delicacy of a man carrying fragile, explosive glass. The massive knight knelt clumsily by the bed, keeping his eyes respectfully lowered. "Your morning meal, little lady," the giant warrior mumbled softly, placing the heavy silver tray onto the soft mattress. The tray was laden with roasted fowl, thick slices of hot spiced cheese, and a massive bowl of rich, creamy porridge sweetened with dark berries. It was an absolute feast, more food than Elise had ever seen in a single week at the castle. Elise looked from the massive knight to Rowan, seeking silent permission from her ultimate protector. Rowan nodded slowly, a faint, genuinely warm smile touching the harsh corners of his mouth. "Eat, little one," Rowan commanded softly. "The kingdom's larders belong to you now." Elise picked up a heavy silver spoon, taking a careful bite of the warm, rich porridge. The flavor was incredibly profound, a magnificent contrast to the stale, rock-hard rye bread she had once stolen to survive. Rowan watched her eat in profound silence. The tiny, fragile spark that had saved his life in the freezing dark was now safely guarded within the ultimate fortress. His primary duty of preservation was complete now. The time for absolute, cataclysmic retribution had finally arrived. Rowan stood up, his massive frame unfurling to its full, terrifying height. "Rest today, Elise," the king instructed gently. "I have matters of the realm to attend to." "Are you leaving?" Elise asked, a tiny flicker of old anxiety crossing her bright eyes. "Only to the wardroom," Rowan assured her, his deep voice an immovable anchor of safety. "My guards stand right outside this door. Nothing in this world can harm you here." Rowan turned and walked out of the royal chambers, his heavy boots echoing absolute, undeniable authority. As he crossed the threshold, the warmth completely vanished from his fierce eyes, replaced instantly by the freezy-zoid of the abyss. He strode into the grand tactical hall, where his elite generals stood waiting around a massive, carved stone map of the Northern Territory. The atmosphere in the room was incredibly heavy, thick with the intoxicating anticipation of impending war. Rowan approached the head of the heavy oak table, his presence commanding absolute, paralyzing silence from the hardened veterans. He looked down at the wooden markers representing the usurper's forces trapped within the walls of Ironhold. "The snows have blocked the southern passes," Rowan stated flatly, his voice echoing like rolling thunder. "Vance is entirely cut off from his mercenary reinforcements. They are trapped in the valley, my king," the vanguard captain conferred, his heavy fists resting on the stone table. "Their cavalry is broken and their morale is shattered." "We do not lay siege," Rowan commanded, his dark eyes fixed entirely on the miniature representation of his former prison. "A siege grants them time to hope," the sovereign continued, his tone devoid of all mercy. "We will march tonight, under the cover of the absolute darkness." He placed a massive, heavily scarred finger directly onto the wooden marker of Ironhold. "We will shatter their gates before the sun rises," Rowan declared. "There will be no parley. There will be no terms of surrender offered to traitors." The generals nodded in absolute unison, their blood running hot with the promise of righteous vengeance. "They chained their rightful sovereign like a rabid beast in the freezing mud," Rowan rumbled, his voice dropping to a terrifying, malevolent whisper. "But their ultimate crime," the king stated, the image of Elise's bruised, frosted-bit hands flashing violently through his mind, was their profound cruelty to the most vulnerable soul in my domain. He looked up, his abyssal gaze sweeping over his towering, heavily armored commanders. "Burn the banners of the usurper," Rowan ordered with chilling, absolute finality. "Leave no stone of that wretched keep standing upon another." Far below the mountain sanctuary, across the frozen, howling wasteland, the atmosphere inside Ironhold was one of pure, suffocating terror. Lord Vance paced frantically back and forth in the great hall, his expensive furs doing absolutely nothing to stop his violent shivering. The great blizzard had trapped him in the fortress he had wrongfully stolen. His elite hunting party had never returned from the high ridge. The few scouts he had managed to send out had reported finding the horrific, mangled remains of his heavy cavalry, utterly annihilated by blunt, catastrophic force. Vance poured himself another chalice of heavy wine, his hands shaking so violently that the dark red liquid spilled across the heavy wooden table. He knew exactly what was waiting for him in the freezing darkness beyond the castle walls. He had not just failed to kill the wolf, he had foolishly allowed the apex predator of the north to return to his waiting pack. The cook, Gilbert, lay moaning pitifully in the corner of the hall, his shattered shoulder wrapped in dirty bandages. "He is coming," Gilbert whimpered, his small eyes wide with absolute primal horror. "The beast is coming back for us." Vance threw the silver chalice against the stone wall, the loud clatter doing nothing to drown out the oppressive silence of the fortress. "Double the watch!" Vance screamed at his terrified, exhausted guards. "Barricade the main gates with heavy timber. Do not let anyone sleep!" But the usurper knew in his malevolent, cowardly heart that thick timber and heavy iron would offer absolutely no protection. The sovereign had already broken the strongest chains forged by mortal men. Back in the obsidian sanctuary, the deep, mournful blast of the heavy war horns echoed throughout the glacial valley. Ronan stood in the central armor, his massive arms extended as his squires secured the heavy plates of his pitch-black sovereign armor. The dark steel absorbed the flickering torchlight, making the towering king look like the absolute manifestation of the night itself. He strapped a massive, two-handed broadsword to his broad back, a weapon so heavy no ordinary knight could even lift it from the rack. Rowan stepped out into the freezing courtyard, looking over the hundreds of elite, heavily armored warriors formed in perfect, silent ranks. He looked up toward the high, secure window of the royal chamber, knowing Alyssa was sleeping peacefully within its absolute protection. He had promised the little girl a world without fear. To fulfill that celestial promise, he would completely obliterate the men who had built her nightmare. Rowan drew his massive broadsword, the heavy steel singing a terrifying, lethal note in the freezing air. "March," the sovereign commanded softly. The avalanche of dark steel moved forward into the night, bringing absolute, catastrophic retribution to the frozen plains. The march of the sovereign's vanguard was entirely devoid of the chaotic, frantic noise of ordinary armies. They moved through the freezing mountain passes like a monolithic shadow, a silent tide of dark steel heavily intent on absolute destruction. Rowan led the massive column of heavy infantry from the front, his gigantic frame easily breaking the deep snow for his men. The heavy, two-handed broadsword resting against his shoulder was a dark anchor of impending doom. As the colossal walls of Ironhold finally loomed through the pale, freezing mist, the usurper's sentries frantically sounded their alarm horns. The frantic, terrified notes echoed pitifully across the desolate valley, exposing the absolute panic festering within the fortress. Lord Vance had ordered massive oak timbers to be braced against the primary gates in a desperate bid for survival. It was a completely futile gesture against the sheer kinetic mass of the true king's wrath. Rowan did not order his men to construct siege engines or heavy battering rams. He simply walked up to the towering wooden gates, his heavy boots crushing the frozen earth with terrifying, methodical precision. The terrified archers on the high walls completely froze, their trembling fingers entirely unable to release their bowstrings. They were staring down at a primordial god of war, and they knew their primitive weapons were absolutely useless. Rowan placed his massive, gauntleted hands flat against the heavy oak doors of the fortress. He closed his abyssal eyes, channeling the vast, cataclysmic strength of his muscular frame directly into the ancient wood. With a deafening, explosive crack that sounded like a mountain splitting in half, the massive iron hinges instantly failed. The incredibly thick oak doors exploded inward, shattering into thousands of lethal, flying splinters. The heavy barricades behind the gates were completely pulverized by the overwhelming physical inertia. Rowan stepped through the ruined threshold, his dark cape billowing violently in the rushing winter wind. Behind him, hundreds of elite, heavily armored knights poured into the courtyard, an unstoppable avalanche of sovereign retribution. The usurpers' garrison immediately threw down their weapons, falling to their knees in absolute groveling despair. There was no glorious battle, nor was there any honorable clash of steel. It was a pure, unadulterated display of absolute dominance over broken, cowardly men. Lord Vance stood entirely paralyzed on the stone steps of the great hall, his expensive furs slipping from his trembling shoulders. He watched in sheer horror as the towering king approached him, moving with the terrifying grace of an apex predator. "Rowan, please," Vance screamed, his aristocratic facade shattering completely into pathetic, weeping terror. "I yield the fortress. I will give you all the gold in the southern vaults." Rowan did not even bother to draw his massive sword. He walked up the stone steps, entirely ignoring the frantic, begging pleas of the broken usurper. Rowan reached out with his heavy right hand and effortlessly gripped Vance by the ornate collar of his velvet tunic. With a single, powerful heave, he threw the arrogant lord down the stone stairs and directly into the freezing mud of the courtyard. Vance landed heavily near the exact center ring where he had chained the king weeks ago. Gilbert the cook was already there, huddled in the dirty snow, sobbing uncontrollably and clutching his shattered shoulder. Rowan towered over the two miserable men, his immense physical presence entirely eclipsing the pale moonlight. "You offered no mercy to the innocent," Rowan stated coldly, his deep voice carrying the absolute finality of supreme justice. "You shall receive none in return." Rowan signaled to his towering vanguard captain with a slight tilt of his majestic head. The massive knight stepped forward, carrying heavy, rusted iron shackles, freshly salvaged from the castle dungeons. Without a single word, the vanguard chained Lord Vance and the cruel cook directly to the heavy iron ring in the center of the courtyard. They were fastened securely to the frozen stone, left entirely exposed to the merciless elements they had forced upon a starving child. "Leave them," Rowan commanded softly, turning his broad back on the crying men. "This fortress is a tomb now. Let the winter claim its rightful due." The elite army marched out of Ironhold, leaving the heavy gates shattered and the courtyard abandoned to the freezing wind. The reign of the usurpers was entirely eradicated in a single, bloodless night of overwhelming physical terror. Months slowly passed, and the brutal, unforgiving winter finally surrendered its icy grip on the northern realm. The heavy snows melted into rushing, crystalline rivers, completely fulfilling the sovereign's promise of a warmer world. In the heart of the capital city, the grand obsidian palace was bathed in brilliant, golden spring sunlight. Inside the cavernous royal gardens, the air was heavily perfumed with blooming winter roses and fresh, sweet grass. Alice ran happily along the polished marble pathways, her small feet completely protected by soft, expensive leather slippers. She wore a beautiful, intricately tailored dress of deep crimson silk, completely transforming her into a vision of pure, aristocratic grace. Her cheeks were perfectly flushed with healthy color, and her bright eyes completely lacked the heavy shadows of her traumatic past. She was no longer a fragile, starving orphan hiding from violent cooks. She was vibrant, incredibly healthy, and entirely surrounded by a fortress of absolute love. The heavy oak doors of the garden pavilion opened smoothly. Rowan stepped out into the sunlight, leaving his dark, heavy armor behind for the elegant, embroidered tunics of a peacetime monarch. His massive frame was just as terrifyingly powerful, but the abyssal darkness in his fierce eyes had been permanently replaced by profound warmth. Alice stopped running and immediately turned toward him, her face lighting up with absolute joy. "Row!" was she called out, completely abandoning royal decorum as she ran directly toward the towering king. Rowan knelt gracefully on the grass, catching her easily in his massive, muscular arms. He lifted her effortlessly into the warm spring air, his deep, rumbling laughter echoing pleasantly across the manicured gardens. "You are moving very fast today, little one," Rowan noted warmly, setting her gently back onto her feet. "The physician said I am completely strong now," Alice declared proudly, holding onto his thick, heavily scarred fingers. Rowan looked down at her small, clean hands, completely devoid of the terrible cracks and purple bruises he remembered. He felt a profound, overwhelming sense of sovereign peace settle permanently into his vast chest. "You are indeed strong," Rowan agreed quietly. "But today you must be formal. The entire court has gathered in the great hall." Alice looked up at him, a tiny flicker of nervous anticipation crossing her delicate features. "Are they waiting for me?" "They are waiting for their princess," Rowan corrected smoothly, offering his massive hand to guide her. They walked together through the towering marble corridors of the palace. The visual contrast between them was breathtakingly poetic. He was a colossal, scarred mountain of dark power, a man who had crushed armored armies with his bare hands. She was a tiny, delicate flower, barely reaching past his thick leather belt. Yet he walked at her exact pace, entirely yielding his overwhelming physical presence to accommodate her small, gentle steps. They reached the colossal double doors of the great hall, where hundreds of nobles and elite knights stood in absolute respectful silence. As Rowan entered, the entire congregation dropped to one knee, their heavy armor clinking softly against the polished stone floor. Rowan guided Alice directly to the elevated dais, where the massive, dark iron throne of the sovereign awaited. He did not sit. Instead, he stood before the gathered aristocracy and turned to face the small girl. The towering vanguard captain stepped forward, carrying a heavy velvet cushion. Resting upon the dark velvet was a magnificent, delicately forged crown of solid gold, entirely encrusted with flawless, radiant diamonds. It was a profound, permanent upgrade from the fragile vine circlet he had woven for her in the frozen mountains. Rowan lifted the heavy golden crown with his massive, battle-hardened hands. He looked down at Alice, his fierce, aristocratic face radiating an absolute, unyielding devotion. "When the world abandoned me to the freezing abyss, you offered me your only sustenance," Rowan declared loudly, his deep voice carrying to the farthest corners of the hall. "You saved the sovereign," Rowan proclaimed, his dark eyes locked entirely onto hers. "Therefore you have saved this entire kingdom." To the absolute shock and awe of the gathered nobility, the massive, invincible king slowly lowered himself to one knee before the tiny child. He bowed his dark head respectfully, leveling his fierce gaze with her wide, innocent eyes. With incredible, meticulous gentleness, Rowan placed the heavy golden crown upon Alice's dark hair. "I name you Alice, Princess of the Realm, and sole heir to the obsidian throne," Rowan commanded, his words weaving an unbreakable celestial decree. Alice reached up, her small fingers lightly touching the cold, beautiful gold resting on her head. She looked at the colossal man kneeling before her, the dangerous beast who had violently destroyed her enemies to keep her perfectly safe. She stepped forward and wrapped her small, fragile arms tightly around his thick, muscular neck. "Thank you," she whispered softly against his broad shoulder, completely indifferent to the hundreds of nobles watching them. Rowan wrapped his massive arms around her small frame, completely enveloping her in a fortress of absolute warmth and unshakable security. The storm of their past was entirely eradicated. The Abyssal King had finally found his humanity, and the Forgotten Stray had finally found her crown. In this new, warm world, the sovereign and his little princess would never know the cold again. Watching Alice choose kindness when she had absolutely nothing left really stayed with me. It's a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about force. It's about having a heart when the world tries to take it away. Thanks for sticking around. If this story meant something to you, hit that subscribe button. I'm genuinely curious. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And hey, help me out. What should happen in our next story? I'll be reading your ideas.